My biggest takeaway after playing the latest installment of Life is Strange is that video game narratives could be so much more. If I had to give it a rating, this is easily a 9 out of 10 game. This is, in my opinion, Life is Strange at its best. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of what makes this game so good, I feel as though I have to put some thoughts forward. Whether you've seen videos online dismissing this franchise as little more than Tumblr-esque fiction pandering to college girls with little interest in anything but an easygoing storyline and lesbian sexual tension between characters, or you feel underwhelmed by its presentation and premise because of the lack of substantial gameplay elements, I still think you should give this franchise a shot. If you're anywhere near an appropriate age to do so, I highly recommend you experience any piece of media for yourself. Sure, a stranger on the internet can tell you that these games are highly political, biased social justice warrior dens that promote ideas that are harmful to people across time and space. And while this may be true or false, I still think it is best if you go ahead and immerse yourself into the world the developers have created. This way you can tell firsthand if these claims are true or not. Speaking of which, this franchise splits people into a dichotomy. You either hate it or absolutely love it, and this game is no different. This is because this video game is highly narrative, meaning there is little interaction the player has to do with the world around them to actually change anything in contrast to other genres. Since the game is narrative, it has a strong emphasis on the characters. If you play video games to perform in a competitive or mechanical way, this game may not be for you. Finally, much like RPGs, the relationship you build with the game as you go through it relies on your ability to understand the world, the characters, and the choices they make in that world. What I'm trying to say is this: if you dislike games like Disco Elysium, Death Stranding, or even Song of Farca, you will dislike this franchise. Even if you liked Telltale games, you might not like Life is Strange, simply because it varies too differently in its premise. Comparing it to the Walking Dead series of games, or The Wolf Among Us, is not only unfair, it's also wrong to do so. While Telltale seeks immersion in a fictional world for entertainment purposes, I strongly believe Life is Strange seeks immersion in a fictional world in an attempt to teach the player a new perspective about his or her life. While this may sometimes completely miss the mark, I'm looking at you, Life is Strange 2, you complete shitbrick of a game. I do think this one is genuinely great at what it's trying to do. For a long time, I actually used to think the first game was the best in the series at this, followed by Before the Storm closely and the second game by a long shot. I might make other videos on these games later on, but for now I would like to focus on True Colors and how it might just be a masterpiece. I'll let you decide on that. Before we continue, I do want to make sure I thank Sir Swag for his latest shoutout in his video. I've been meaning to make a follow-up for the longest time, but seeing as this is a higher quality project, I thought it'd be nice to mention it here. Thank you all for helping me reach 250 subscribers, it's something I never thought I would reach. I will be resuming videos on this channel, so expect more in the future. Oh, and obviously, spoilers ahead.
I think I got this personality. This person's not my whole mentality.
It's a good question, isn't it? We all know a good story when we see it, although it might vary wildly from person to person. So what exactly makes a story good? Is it the characters? Could it be the premise, the world building, and the lore? Maybe it's the medium, what platform you distribute your story on. These are all reasonable answers, but the answer is really obvious when you think about it. A good writer makes a good story. And fortunately, we had the chance to have great writers for this game. If you search for the game on Steam, and you take a moment to see who made it, you might see something pretty interesting. Don't Nod hasn't made this one. Now, please don't take this the wrong way, but Don't Nod hasn't made a good story since the first Life is Strange. And I mean that. I'm sure the good people at Don't Nod are trying really hard, but ever since the first game, they failed to replicate what made their players resonate with the message they were putting out. The first game was pretty great. The only massive gripe people had was with Chloe, which a lot of people considered to be unlikable. As this wasn't addressed in the game itself, it stuck out like a sore thumb, but the rest of the narrative is truly good. Then came Life is Strange 2. While people like to seem the fact that the endings were wildly different from each other, it is still by far the worst one in the series. The political overtone and choices in the game, coupled with the fact that you are railroaded throughout a disjointed story without having a lot of control over the characters, makes for an unpleasant, at times painfully boring experience with a message that won't stick the landing in some cases. Finally, while it is not in this franchise, I would like to point out how Dontnod has been trying out different things outside of the Life is Strange universe, while also not changing their formula. Tell Me Why is proof Dontnod has major issues when it comes to dialogue and character development. The pacing is wrong, the story is one-dimensional, and the gameplay is tedious. But alas, a savior comes. A studio with competent writers and people who can imagine fully fledged characters. Remember how people hated Chloe? Well, turns out there's a reason for that, and it's a damn good reason too. A couple years after the first game comes out, a prequel lasting only 3 chapters hits the digital shelves. Deck 9 develops Life is Strange Before the Storm, and essentially fixes the flaws and plot holes the first game has. This, to me, shows one thing: these developers actually love this game and this franchise. Not only that, but they also want it to be the best possible experience for the people who'll be playing it. Not only that, but they also understand that a complete story is an immersive story. Not only that, but they also understand that unlikable characters or bad characters aren't simply unlikable or bad for the sake of being unlikable or bad. Not only that, but there's also... Do you understand where I'm going with this? In 3 short chapters, Deck 9 has showed more devotion to their spin-off than Dontnod has to every game following Life is Strange. They probably had less than a year to develop the game and yet made a complete, compelling story about highly disliked characters, making sense of it all. If you ask me, this is out there with New Vegas in terms of development accomplishment. It kinda makes me think of Bethesda and Obsidian, with Fallout and Outer Worlds respectively, in a sense. While the former is complacent with their fanbase, happy with the reputation they accrued over time, the latter is hungry to prove they have got what it takes to replace their competitors but have little resources to do so. However, in Life is Strange's case, the latter wins, as Square Enix parted away from Dontnod a couple years ago at the time of writing this video. To me, it was a matter of time before Deck 9 was offered to handle the Life is Strange franchise, as they are much more competent than the company they replaced. Characters in true colors are compelling, and they don't feel as though as they are placed in the world for you to simply interact with them and get something out of them. As you go through the story, you have the choice of interacting with these characters or not. You can learn about their issues or problems, or not. You can decide to fix their problem, or not. You can decide if you want to hurt them, or not. In a sense, the characters are alive, complete. Whether or not you do anything doesn't change the fact that something is going to happen anyway. This is because the setting of True Colors is carefully built to be exactly as big as it needs to be, while providing plenty of opportunities to explore it throughout the different chapters. A common complaint about the game I've seen plastered over the internet is how small the town of Haven Springs is compared to the other settings of previous games. While the first Life is Strange had pretty big areas to explore, they sometimes were either lacking in the amount of things the characters could interact with or in quality. The best moments, in my opinion, were the small areas packed to the brim with details. Chloe's house and the junkyard, off the top of my head. Life is Strange 2 had questionable areas. The best were at the beginning of the game, with the house and the cabin. It's where we could learn the most about the world these characters were in, their situation. Before the Storm, being a prequel and being made by Deck 9, went against the grain and stuck to mainly small areas with a lot of detail. They carried that mentality into True Colors, and it works perfectly. Every corner, every character, every nook of Haven has something to discover. Be it a self-conscious jogger, an anxious miner, a sculpture, a pyramid of empty beer cans, a business card, a fucking cat I can't pet, or even minigames, Haven is full of life and things to check out. And the best about it is that every object you can interact with actually has some amount of significance to the story. It supplements it in a way only video games could do. That self-conscious jogger turns out to be one of the first people that isn't a main character we can make feel better. That anxious miner calls his mom and informs us of the situation the workers at Typhon, the mining company and primary employer in the city, feel about the development of the story. The sculpture is foreshadowing an important event in the story with one of the main characters. The pyramid shows that Haven, while being a small community, can party just like college students when the time is right. The business card informs us of how Alex and Gabe, the protagonist and her brother, had to join the orphanage system of the United States. The fucking cat I still can't pet is a dastardly little animal that you will need to move in order to get a list. The minigames inform you of the pre-established scores of the characters that played this machine and how good they were at it, building on their relationships with one another. Every object has a reason to be there, every person feels like a person. And the best in all of that is that as you move through the chapters, Haven changes. There's a whole chapter dedicated to a LARP, a live-action roleplay, which makes exploring the town a whole new experience. The Spring Festival is the same. The town changes so dramatically that it tells the player, hey, there's new stuff to be explored even if it's technically the same place. Therefore, throughout the game, Haven never feels still, like Arcadia Bay could sometimes be. I really think this is the most efficient setting Life is Strange has ever had. Every room is packed to the brim with things and stories and people you can interact with. It lets you understand the world around you and explore it to such a deep level that it feels like every action you take could shift the way you see someone or something. The passage where you help Ducky, or Sir Reginald McAllister III, reminisce about the golden days of his relationship with his deceased wife, quite literally transforms your perception of the Black Lantern completely. What used to be a funny bear carving in the corner of the tavern is now the starting point to the most beautiful relationship this man has ever had. What was a simple table where customers would sit is now the place where he asked her to marry him, and this kind of cognitive shift is peppered through the entire game. This is one of many situations where what you thought you knew about someone or something is completely thrown out of the window in order to establish the truth. If this doesn't show competency from Deck 9 and their abilities to craft a world where characters have the ability to fully exist, then I don't know what will. Every gamer can remember at least one video game that struck a chord with them. Maybe it was the difficulty of Dark Souls, the wonder of exploring a new Zelda game, breaking a mechanical ceiling like in Monkey Ball, beating an opponent in a fighting game like Guilty Gear, or maybe it was the story and how you, the protagonist, impacts it. Papers, Please is a great example, in my opinion. But in every case, there's a way these games stuck out. A reason which bridges every genre, every game, and every gamer. That would be focus. A focused game is a work of artisanship that pushes its unique characteristics to the fullest, making complete use of them. It's the reason why people remember Dead Cells, but don't remember Magicite. Now, don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean that an unfocused game is necessarily a bad game. There's also the fact that you can remember a game for a variety of reasons. Maybe you were given it at your 9th birthday and you have fond memories of playing with your friends. It simply means this. If you strip away everything else other than the game and the player, that is to say marketing, hype, branding, and all of that, the player will prefer the focused game over the unfocused one, simply because it does what it wants to do better. Overall, that's what makes a game stand out. Now the question becomes, what is TrueColors' intended focus, and does it utilize it to its fullest? Since we can't directly talk to the developers of the game, we can derive the focus of the game with two things. Firstly, the developer's description of the content, and secondly, by actually playing the game. Remember how I said experiencing media firsthand was important? This is partly why. If you don't play it, even if you watch someone else play it, you cannot get a full picture of what the game is about. According to the developers, the description reads, Life is Strange TrueColors is a narrative adventure featuring Alex Chen, a young woman with an astonishing supernatural power through which she can experience the strong emotions of others. While Alex's power will lead to moments of great joy, it can also bring her into the orbit of violent anger, world-altering sadness, and irrepressible fear. As she probes the mysteries of Haven Springs, revealing its secrets, Alex will discover moments of quiet transcendence, but also be drawn into moments of sudden, bloody violence with lasting consequences. The game also features strong language, drug references, some suggestive themes, and the use of alcohol. So, I don't think I'm crazy when I say this is a gameplay description. It talks about Alex's power, its potential, and how it will affect her and the world around her, and what the game contains in terms of age-related stuff in the world. What it doesn't talk about is the story, which is what makes Life is Strange, Life is Strange. And I don't think it's that bad either, although maybe a little clarity on the nature of the narrative might be good. Now, if you were to play the games, you would probably arrive to the same conclusion that I did. TrueColors, like any good Life is Strange game, is about one thing and one thing only: taking a core element of human life, using supernatural abilities as a way to put that element in control of a character and tell a narrative that highlights a part of the human experience. The first game was about taking the flow of time, giving Max Caulfield a supernatural ability to rewind it, and highlighting the fact that you cannot run away from consequences, simply deal with them or run away from them. Before the Storm was about, well, okay, in this case it's a little weird. Because it's a prequel and it seeks to patch up the issues of the first game, I bundle it up with the first one. They did keep an ability, but it didn't really shape the way the character saw the world. Life is Strange 2 is, well, a shipwreck. I will never pass an opportunity to bash this game, but it still attempts at this. The second game is about taking the manipulation of your environment, giving Daniel the supernatural ability of telekinesis, and highlighting the fact that while you can modify your environment, you are still bound to it, aka you can never completely detach yourself from experience. True Colors, in this case, is about emotions and feelings, giving Alex Chen a supernatural ability to quite literally see and feel for herself the emotions of others, and highlighting the fact that grief, when it happens, is not only lived differently by every person surrounding the deceased, but that you can also choose how you want to deal with it as a person. While this may seem simple when I say it like that, the way this is done is actually pretty complex. I think the best way to go through this is by explaining the 2 playthroughs I've done of the game so far, as every choice is basically a split between 2 choices and an action in some cases. I do think that for the majority of players, 2 playthroughs with opposite choices gives you the most bang for your buck in terms of time to content ratio. The way I can see it, your narrative experience relies on 5 gameplay choices you have to make as a player. These are ordered from most important to least important for the narrative. The first and most obvious is power usage. Will you be proactive with it or cautious? The second is agreeableness. Will you strive for truth or be satisfied with making people feel better? The third is your approach to situations. Will you be vindictive or forgiving? The fourth is your romantic interest. Is Alex interested in Ryan or Steph? The fifth is your final choice. Do you feel as though Alex is better off in Haven, or should she hit the road to play music? I think I could have mentioned this earlier, but I should tell you that the choices matter in this game, and they matter a lot when it comes to your perception of the main character. This wildly differs from the railroad of Life is Strange 2 and sometimes the one in Life is Strange 1. So be prepared to have pretty different opinions of Alex as you go through your second playthrough. My first run through the game was the following. I chose to be cautious with my power. I went with a disagreeable Alex. I went with a forgiving Alex. I went with Steph as Alex's romantic interest. And I stayed in Haven. As I progressed through the game, I felt as though Alex was a discreet, analytical, and idealistic person. Troubled by her past and her brother's death, she had issues connecting with people. But when she did, she wanted only what was best for them according to her own system of values. She wanted justice and to belong to somewhere. Someone. This meant she didn't put her trust in everyone, but the people she did put her trust in were very important to her. She had a positive attitude and a good heart, and her grief was lived as a need to help others around her. For example, the first time I won against Steph and saw Alex pop off, I reloaded the whole chapter because I thought Steph would take it badly. When I did it the second time, and understood that Alex's goal was to actually cheer her up by reminding Steph of the times her brother used to nag her, it made it all the more special that I didn't use my power proactively. Because Alex was disagreeable, it meant to stand up for what she believed to be good. The game does force you into seeking justice for Gabe's death, but it doesn't force you into choosing any particular way to do so. It will simply reinforce the chosen behavior after you've committed to an option. For example, after Gabe dies, his girlfriend Charlotte receives an affidavit from Typhon. If she shuts her mouth and doesn't press charges, she gets an absurd amount of money. Enough to send her kid, who Gabe cared deeply about, to college. You get the option between telling Charlotte not to sign it and stand up for what's right, or to tell her you understand the payout is too good to not accept and she will sign it. I went with the first option, and by reading her emotional state after the fact, she answers with, "Of course she's right, but this could have been really good for Ethan," or something along those lines. This is another time when the game gives you the option to react to the loss and grief of Alex and others around her. While it isn't directly related to Gabe's death and how Alex feels about it, how she impacts her environment by grounding herself in her belief allows her to grieve in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. As I went with a forgiving Alex, I didn't have to take into consideration my choices often. but the time that I did have to, it had a massive impact on the characters and the story. The best example of this is, in my opinion, the whole situation with Mac. While the climax of the story is also great, don't worry, we'll get back to it later, I think this is best to understand how you can turn a negative situation into a positive one. On the night Gabe dies, Mac receives a phone call telling him to stop the incoming blast scheduled that night. Mac initially denies this and tries to hide away from questions and remarks. You eventually come to use your power on Mac, which shows you how scared he is of Typhon, and for good reason. He's scared he will lose his job, his girlfriend, or even his life if he talks about what happened that night, without knowing, at that point in the story, if there's anyone else responsible for Gabe's death, or even if Mac is being rational about Typhon. He admits to receiving a phone call and communicating Gabe's message, but the blast went off anyway. The ball is now in Alex's camp. Do you forgive Mac for lying earlier, potentially lying in the moment and having potentially killed your brother? Or do you condemn him for his previous actions? Even with all the wrong Mac has caused beforehand, which could be much greater than what I knew at the time, I forgave him. In the later chapters, Mac still has his job, is still with his girlfriend Riley, and is enjoying a nice beer at the Spring Festival. Mac lives without fear because Alex decided to choose a certain way to live out her grief. Mac and Riley lived Gabe's death together as a result. While the romantic interest you choose doesn't really affect the narrative all that much, I still think it's important to mention that I picked Steph. With the previous choices I made with Alex, this turned out to be a great way for her to empathize with someone who is living a similar situation. Steph and Gabe were best friends, and she considered him as a sort of brother figure in her life. The love that blossoms from this similarity in grief they're living through truly is beautiful. They look to the progress of their lives, the potential of the future, for hope. They both hurt from Gabe's death, but want to make something good out of it, as a stepping stone towards something better. Because I chose Steph, and she made it clear she wanted to leave the choice of staying or leaving to Alex, I actually had to think pretty hard about this decision. Them hitting the road is a perfect way to finish their story. So why did I choose to stay in Haven? Well, to be entirely honest with you, because I didn't totally think it through. I did do an extra express run of the last chapter to choose the other option, and it makes so much more sense like that. However, even the weaker option of staying in Haven is great. Steph and Alex grow together, take care of the record shop, living happy and fulfilled with one another, and moving forward after Gabe's death and Jed has been convicted. Alex has made a life for herself, accepted her loss and finalized her grief, and grew as a person from it. My second run was the complete opposite. I chose to be proactive with my power. I went with an agreeable Alex. I went with a condemning Alex. I went with Ryan as Alex's romantic interest. And I left Haven. Now, I won't narrate my entire playthrough or anything, but I do want you to know this. As I was going with an opposite run to what I did before, I decided to also apply this thinking to my method of play. Instead of delving into the world of Haven Springs and exploring the world, I went into True Colors with a minimalistic approach. I would play through this game with as little interaction, side objective completion, and overall exploration. And let me tell you something, it was bad. I don't say this lightly. What was beforehand a 9 out of 10 game suddenly became a 4 out of 10 game. I mentioned beforehand that video games were works of artisanship, but this is not entirely true. While I'm still not quite sure on where it stands, I can safely say that video games possess the potential to harbor some qualities of art. This may not apply to every game, but in the case of narrative games, this is something that becomes quite apparent when playing through them various times. You see, to fully experience what a work of art has to offer, you have to experience it in a certain manner. Take cinema, for example. While you can watch movies on your phone, you will not get the full experience doing so. This is because a cinema theater is an area that was purposefully designed and created to watch those movies. It is, in a certain way, the best way to do so. Not only is the theater finely tuned to provide you with an experience you couldn't get any other way, it's also finely tuned to allow the director of the movie to fully express his vision. And it goes the other way around too. The director will choose shots, sound capture techniques, and equipment that guide the theater into what settings they must finely tune. And because of this, they expect you to go to the movie theaters so that you can experience their visions to the fullest. Note, however, that in this case you can switch the movie theater with a streaming service like Netflix, and this still works, although I personally don't think this is a great way to do things. Well, anyway, this is one of the qualities of art. The way art is experienced depends equally on the vision of the creator and how the work of art is displayed. However, as the director cannot force you into displaying the work of art how they want, they instead try to nudge you into the right direction by virtue of quality. You will get a better experience at the theater than on your phone, but nothing stops you from looking at Taxi Driver on your phone. In this case, you might be stuck with having a worse experience because the intended way of watching the movie is no longer available. This applies to video games, but because of their nature, you never have to be stuck with anything, at least not from lack of support. You might not be able to play a game altogether because you lack the hardware, but in this case it would be like having no phone or no access to the theater. As long as you have the hardware for it, you can play a video game the way it was intended to be experienced. Which leads me to narrative video games, and the fact that some people feel as though they're overall bad or offer a bad experience. In the case of True Colors, I soon realized with my second playthrough how you could brush this off as a 8-hour long shitty story with weird pacing and character development. Not because I could imagine it or whatever, but because I intentionally played it this way. I guess this is also a pretty good moment to mention that I put myself in an opposite situation to the one I was in while playing the first time. My first playthrough was done at night, in my room, with plenty of snacks and water with my lights off. My second playthrough was done in the day, with people occasionally barging in, me having to physically go get food and water with my lights and window open. In the second playthrough, not only did I have no intention of exploring the world Deck 9 had built, but I also found myself to be way less engaged with the story that I did experience. Not because I had seen it before, since I chose entirely different paths, but because I was constantly distracted. It was impossible for me to focus on the game and what it had to offer because I couldn't immerse myself into it. I wasn't playing the game the way it was intended to be played. But even if I stick to the game itself, the developers clearly try to nudge you in the correct direction by punishing you and reminding you of everything you missed on the end screen. If you don't visit the dispensary in the second chapter, Charlotte is bought out by Typhon and signs the affidavit. Now, she is locked out of helping you on the last chapter of the game, simply because you chose not to visit her a few hours before. If you don't visit the record store in chapter 2, not only do you miss out on helping Hector find his dog, you're also locked out of a scene with Steph and an important one with Ethan in chapter 3. The game reminds you of this with the end screen. Therefore, I think it's only fair to say that narrative games, and True Colors, can be played in any way but have a specific set of directives which will exponentially improve your experience with it. I believe these are the following, although I might be missing some. First, a narrative game needs your attention. Without it, it cannot provide you with immersiveness. Second, a narrative game needs your effort. If you don't engage with its content, it cannot tell its full story. And finally, third, a narrative game needs your patience. Being that its goal is to tell you a story, it requires you to follow it, not outpace it. With these three things in place, the game will reward you with an engaging and immersive experience, which will realistically last you about 16 hours or so if you take the longest route possible. If you rush it and go as fast as you can, which I did all while recording, the game will at least give you 8 hours of content. It won't be good content, but at least you'll have 8 hours of it. Notice that engaging with True Colors completely doubles your playtime. I personally recommend playing through one chapter a night in the span of a week. It's much more manageable that way, and the story still feels fresh in your mind as you progress through it. Going back to the second playthrough, while I will not go into too much detail, I would like to talk about some things I thought of while playing the game again. One of the first things I was asking myself was, why do people think this game is boring? It's usually a question I ask myself while playing more experimental games or indie games, but I did see some similar sentiment towards this one too. I think I figured it out, and I would want to share it with you. A lot of parallels can be drawn between Life is Strange 1 and True Colors. They have a similar narrative structure, the romance options are similar, both characters have superpower, etc. However, one thing the first game had that this game didn't is an overarching and impending cataclysmic event. It puts you in the middle of it all and lets you decide if it should happen or not. You could save the town and be the hero of the story. This is not something that True Colors does at all. It has a much more realistic approach and balanced version of the supernatural elements that permeate the story. You start with the quote-unquote cataclysmic event in the form of Gabe's death. rather than culminating towards it. People who think this game is boring, therefore, might think this is the case because the game lacks weight, and your choices feel as though they don't matter in the grand scheme of things. While I understand where they are coming from, I don't think that a game that doesn't force you to be a superhero is a bad thing. Rather, True Colors allows you to choose between being a hero or a freak, and for a reason. This choice has no impact on the storyline at all, but your perception of the character you are playing changes drastically. If Alex thinks she's a freak, her using the power she has the way she does is wildly different in the eyes of the player compared to her using her power because she thinks she's a hero. Speaking of, the second thing I would like to mention is the story. The story doesn't shift away from its main narrative all that much. This is a story about Alex Chen, who loses her brother and has the power of feelings, going against the mining company who took him away from her. You don't get much say in this, so it feels like a pretty rigid structure, right? Well, I see that term thrown around a lot. It's easy to mention the story without going into details about what the story is. I don't think the story is rigid at all. What is rigid, or in this case well established, is the framework in which the story happens. This isn't a story about Alex Chen, who loses her brother and has the power of feelings, going against the mining company who took him away from her, so much so as this is the story of a girl left to oneself, grieving the loss of her brother and interacting with the people who loved him, making a change in the life of these people, including her own. But to tell a story like that, you need context, and that's where the framework comes in. There are points in the narrative that will happen no matter what. Gabe will die, the people will feel like shit, Alex will want to figure out what happened, and Typhon is gonna try to stop her. Because of this, it might feel like you are guided through the story and therefore your choices don't matter, but this couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is that Life is Strange True Colors allows you to live the story you want to live. In the first chapter of the game, you are introduced to the town and its population by Gabe. When you first meet him, you have the choice between giving him a hug or a handshake. Depending on which one you choose, the following matters a lot. While Gabe is with his girlfriend to try and patch things up with her, Alex goes across the street into Haven's record store. Once there, Ryan introduces himself to Alex, and Alex shakes Ryan's hand. Depending on which choice you made with Gabe, your perception of this interaction changes. If you gave a hug to Gabe, you're politely complying with Ryan's introduction and reciprocating his handshake. But if you gave Gabe a handshake, you're treating Ryan on equal footing. From there, you can interpret it in one of those ways. Either Alex is treating Ryan as pretty much a stranger, or you can decide if that's the moment they quote-unquote fall for each other. Later in the episode, you get a scene where Gabe rocks to Kings of Leon. If you join him in the shenanigans, you've made it clear that Gabe is closer to Alex than Ryan is. But if you don't, you can interpret it in two ways. Either Alex is just being sisterly and thinks Gabe is being lame, or she just has the same amount of distance with him as she does with Ryan. All of this comes from 3 interactions. During the second chapter of the game, you can find Ethan by the river sulking about Gabe's death. Ethan is angry at everyone telling him that everything's okay when it's clearly not. Now, you can completely avoid this and simply stick to the objectives, but if you do go see him, the beginning of the LARP makes a whole lot more sense. He explains he desires to abandon himself in the LARP, but he's still sad about Gabe's death and his grief is not yet finished. Ethan says his mom gets sad because of him being sad, but that's not quite the whole picture now, is it? Ethan is going through the whole 5 stages of grief, and he shifted from anger to sadness, showing growth. It also shows that Ethan, while being much younger than his mom, is capable of moving on. While his frustration eventually dies down and gives way to sadness, Charlotte's frustration grows into a deep anger that fuels her hate against Alex, Gabe, and even her own son. The juxtaposition and character development doesn't appear anywhere in my second playthrough because I skipped Alex's interaction with Ethan in the second chapter and never thought about it afterwards. Since I played a more manipulative Alex in the second playthrough, I got some incredibly interesting dialogue with Diane, Typhon's representative. To figure out what she knows about the circumstances of Gabe's death, you're required to make her feel deeply about the situation in one of 2 ways, anger or sadness. On my first run, the way I exposed all of Typhon's hypocrisy made Diane angry about the fact that she was catching all the flack for them, which is entirely true because after stealing her USB stick after some touchy-feely shenanigans, you can read emails and listen to phone calls where she is clearly pissed at the company. However, this time I chose sadness, and for that I had to talk to her about Alex's relationship and feelings about Gabe. Seeing as though I had previously omitted the truth to spare Eleanor the pain of remembering Gabe's death, when Alex started talking about how the people that cared about him are all incredibly sad and frustrated at his death, how she got robbed of the opportunities to make memories with her brother after all she went through, well, it didn't feel genuine. Not 1 second did I think, wow, Alex really is telling the truth to Diane here. Therefore, even though Alex might have been sad, I thought Alex was a pretty shitty person to mention all those things in the hopes of making Diane feel terrible about her actions, toying with her emotions for her personal gain. It was straight up psychological torture, and Alex felt no remorse whatsoever. If I did decide to tell the truth to Eleanor, or forgive Mac earlier, or anything else that would have made me think Alex was a good person, this might have been different. But this wasn't the case, and I think it's a great way to show how your choices can change your character, or at least the perception you have of it. It's as though your character isn't packed with any pre-existing feelings or dispositions toward the events that unfold. Instead, it's much like a canvas you get to paint however you want. While I'm on the topic of Diane's dialogue, I wanted to mention how easy it was to actually miss content in True Colors. Even in a big sequence like the one you get at the beginning of Chapter 3, there's some interaction you can miss with some things before and during the conversation. In the bar, the Diane dialogue sequence triggers when you clean up a number of dirty dishes from tables. If you either weave exploration with your main objective, or go straight to completing the main objective, you can easily miss Ducky anticipating how horrible the night will be, or how the two people in the back are talking about their video games, or the student who's trying to figure out a song with like 2 lyrics in a dream. You can also, during the main objective, not interact with every item. I believe you need 3 to trigger her emotional side and discover the USB drive, and then call the distraction you picked beforehand. You also have to pick one approach out of the 2, although this isn't any news by now, so half of the possible content is already cut out of your range of interactions. This is something I noticed in the very first chapter on my very first playthrough. Pike joked around and then told me to come grab a beer with him afterwards. Thinking I could go back to the lantern later on, I went up the stairs only to find myself locked out of this interaction. You can also completely skip Diane's emails after grabbing the USB, except the one you need to keep going with the story, which means you'll miss out on an entire dimension of Pike's relationship with Typhon. Within her emails, Diane has a list containing the people on the Haven City Council, including Pike. It's written that Pike actually has a thing for Diane, and has a crush on her, which jeopardizes his position as the sheriff and as a city council member, since it is implied that Diane uses this to her advantage to manipulate Pike. The scene where Alex gets arrested and Pike is fearful of Typhon gets another layer of meaning. Sure, he's scared for Alex and himself, but he's probably also scared of screwing things up with Diane if ever the situation gets out to the public. It changes the player's perception of Pike a lot. You go from this well-meaning, maybe a little naive sheriff who wants to make sure the people in his town are safe, to this potentially incompetent and manipulative police officer who would gladly sacrifice the truth and justice for Gabe's death if it gets him a chance at dating Diane. Another point in the game where you can miss some really important information is in the 3rd chapter, right in the middle of Stephanie's LARP for Ethan. While you go around town trying to find 3 soul gems to complete the mythical Sky Sword so that Thanor can end the Age of Monsters in the Realm of the King, you can stop by a shop called the Magpie Emporium. In this shop, you will find a witch selling 5 items. 3 of them are scrolls to use in battle, 1 of them is an alternate way to deal with the troll you have to defeat, and the 5th is the Blue Soul Gem. There's also this tapestry, this rack for golems, and most importantly a table containing tarot cards. There's nothing indicating you should go to this table, interact with it, and get yourself some cards. However, this is the only way in-game to actually track your progress within the storyline. Not sure if you've made enough moves for the game to consider Steph or Ryan as Alex's romantic interest? Get their cards out and see for yourself. If it's positive, congrats, you're on the right path. Otherwise, you better get moving. Or not. It's up to you. There's also a good amount of foreshadowing going on, especially regarding the main storyline and the last chapter of the game. Don't worry, we'll get back to it. Speaking of foreshadowing, there is a lot of it, but it is not necessarily noticeable. The tarot cards are probably the least subtle way the game tries to clue you in on the truth, but even Charlotte's sculpture in Gabe's apartment is a great way to foreshadow your event with her. Jed's reluctance to talk about his heroic acts foreshadows the true events that transpired that day. The first time you talk to Diane, she'll be happy to see someone else is transplanting into Haven, yet when you read her emotions, she misses home and doesn't feel as though she belongs here, which foreshadows the fact that she's a two-faced bitch. I spoke earlier about how the game has cognitive shifts peppered through its runtime, where your pre-established ideas about someone or something are thrown out of the window. Well, to establish these ideas in the first place, this foreshadowing system is partly responsible. Without it, and without you engaging with the objects and people of Haven Springs, you will not get as strong a twist as you would otherwise. Back to the matter at hand. The way the player interacts and engages with the world shows radically different ways to deal with grief. On my first playthrough, Alex and the people of Haven were able to move on with little hurt. Alex found friends, love, and most importantly, home. She grew as a person following Gabe's death, acquiring not only maturity but also a very important life lesson along the way. Steph moved on, Ryan apologized and stuck with the other two. Riley went to college, with Mac still by her side after he decided to try and be less of a piece of shit than he was already before. Ducky was able to find a friend and shifted his view of his deceased wife from a negative approach to a positive one, remembering instead what made him love her. Charlotte came to understand while she might be a terrible person with bad intentions, it was better to let herself feel that way and try to fix it along the way than to instill numbness. Hector found his dog, Ethan felt great about the LARP, that runner now goes around without being self-conscious, the timid couple finally got together. All in all, Alex's story was a good one, because she decided to take this opportunity to get closer to people and truly, deeply help them. On my second playthrough, not only did Alex not care about hurting others, she didn't care about making it better or trying to help people move on. Alex lost Steph, who left randomly one day without saying anything. Ryan tried to apologize, but Alex told him she couldn't forgive him and he stayed away from her. Riley sacrificed her future, essentially ruining all the efforts Eleanor had been doing so far to get her to college. Although she might now get appropriate care, it is definitely not thanks to you, who decided to hide the truth from Eleanor and Riley. Mac left the town, too scared to stick around, leaving Riley and his life at Haven behind in a jiffy. His entire life was blown away because Alex decided to condemn him after 2 interactions with him. Ducky didn't get any better and didn't form any sort of bond with Alex whatsoever. Alex literally broke Charlotte's ability to feel, rendering her numb for the rest of her life, essentially killing not only her ability to create but also to progress in her journey towards being a better person. While Ethan said he felt good about the LARP, I can't entirely say if he was being honest, as Alex told him that pretending to be happy was just as good as being happy, and one often leads to the other. The runner feels bad every time she goes out. That couple doesn't exist in this run. Overall, Alex's story was a bad one because she decided to let her personal vendetta take over. Not only did she not help anyone, she actively made things worse. And then she leaves the town, deciding to let the bullshit she caused solve itself rather than trying to fix it. I hope that by now it is obvious that you can choose how to live out your grief whenever it will happen, and that your choices have consequences. Deep ones at that too. This is what Life is Strange True Colors tries to tell you, all by putting you in control of Alex Chen, a girl with the power to feel and read the emotions of others. I also hope it is clear that the superpower you are given is a tool, and not the actual goal of the game. Sure, it's nice to see Alex progress in her ability usage, but this is entirely tied to the progression of the story and is used as a plot device rather than its premise. Poignancy is defined by the Merriam-Webster as the quality or state of being poignant. This, to me, is what makes narrative experiences memorable. A story can be moralizing as much as it wants to be. If it doesn't leave a lasting impression, it will be forgotten over time. If you have played Life is Strange True Colors the way Deck 9 has intended, I really don't think you can go through the game without having a lasting impression of its story. Remember when I said we'll get back to it later? Well, it's later, and we need to tackle Chapter 5 of the story. Before I make any blanket statement about it, I want to say that Deck 9 did a great job at making calls back to the previous world that was established in Life is Strange 1 and Before the Storm. Of course, this is something you can really see in the DLC with Steph. They show you the repercussions of your choices in that story. Steph recalling the romance and friendship Rachel and Chloe had, or the article referencing the fallout of Mark Jefferson's arrest are great examples of this. But within the presentation of True Colors itself, you can find these references to the world building that was done for the previous games. The bumper stickers and shirts in the record store recall the story of Chloe, while the Illuminati graffiti that can be found recall the story of Max. While these are pretty good examples, nothing stands out more than the way Alex deals internally with her grief. Max had a similar experience also, where the gameplay becomes more of a psychological analysis of the character and its progression, rather than the regular exploration offered to you by the game. In the first game, the physical world essentially breaks down and the regular logic applied to the world leaves to let symbolic representation take its place. It's probably where Life is Strange 1 becomes its most artistic, as it plays with the notions of time and space and the psychological damage one could suffer from manipulating it. True Colors goes a similar way. However, while it was implied that this passage wasn't a reflection of true reality in Life is Strange 1, here it makes it clear from the get-go as Gabe makes a comeback. You are in Alex's psyche, and the realm of the logical not only breaks down, but the psychological emphasis is turned up all the way to 100. While there is still symbolic representation, it's something that isn't necessarily recognized by the game and instead leaves the player to interpret it however they want, instead of trying to communicate its message through it. The message of True Colors is communicated through what seems the most fitting for this game: cognitive shift. Alex, who is losing consciousness at various points, enters her mind. Here, she will remember a pre-established story, only to unveil the truth and essentially invalidate what she thought she knew before. This happens with her mom in the hospital, where she becomes sad, and her father's departure from her life, where she becomes scared. After she catches on to that and decides to see her past for what it truly was, she hurts. So, now that this is done, I can do my blanket statement. Chapter 5 is monumental and might be one of the best narrative scenes I have ever encountered. I don't say this lightly. I've played a lot of narrative games, going from very good to very bad, without necessarily thinking it was monumental. Plenty of games are monumental in their own right, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily positive. No Man's Sky or Fallout 76 are remembered for their monumental failure, although I have to say the public opinion of the former has changed considerably. In the case of True Colors, I can affirm its 5th chapter is a monumental success. It delivers its message exactly as it should be delivered, in a way that is relevant and novel for the team at hand. Its message can be found in pretty much every character, although you might see it more depending on what choices you've picked. So, what exactly is it? Right, so as you play through the game, this isn't something you necessarily notice for a variety of reasons relating to the nature of video games, most notably self-insertion, but Alex doesn't feel anything. Or at least, she doesn't feel anything by herself. She uses her power and feels the emotions of others, mimics them, and helps them. But she never feels anything. But when she is confronted to herself, in her psyche, she has no choice but to feel. If she doesn't feel, she doesn't notice the truth. Her attention is not brought up to these events and she cannot accept them, therefore locking her out of any potential growth she might have been able to get from them. Once you notice this, it really sets you aback. When John and Gabe fight, Alex cannot read their emotions, as she was too young back then and had not developed her power yet. There is no emotional aura for the entire scene, except at the very end when Alex is scared shitless. She then gains an aura, meaning that the present Alex is reflecting on how she used to feel and identifies why. It takes you out of the gameplay and exposes you to the emotional memory and growth Alex is living without expressively telling you that this is happening. Beyond this, you could further analyze the symbolic meaning of these feelings and the implication of her present self into her past self's life, but I'm not gonna go there. Again, a callback to Life is Strange 1, where they do something similar with time and memory in the dorm scene. The entire pattern Gabe sets in Alex's mind, the player part bit, is a reminder to not think about what is happening too hard. that you can't fully immerse yourself in your feelings if you are analyzing the world around you too much. Something that, again, you've been doing the entire game if you've been playing the game as intended. I also think it's the developer's way to tell you to suspend your disbelief for the time being, although I personally think the setups are all within the margin of belief. Yeah, obviously some stuff is a little weird, but you gotta put it in context. Alex not remembering the final conversation she had with her mom might seem weird, because this is clearly an important moment for her, but you need to think about the fact that this was probably suppressed in her mind for the longest time, to prevent her from feeling. Which brings me to my answer. The message of True Colors is that it is okay to feel. That it is always better to feel something rather than not. What was a story about a girl left to oneself, grieving the loss of her brother and interacting with the people who loved him, making a change in the life of these people, including our own, now becomes this beautiful ode to feeling. Not feelings, but the act of feeling itself. In a final cognitive shift, you uncover the truth about the game, that playing any type of Alex, be it a good or bad person, having a negative or positive experience with her story, leaving a better or worse haven is worth it. It is better than the alternative of having nothing. This places the game's climax not at the end of Alex's story, but rather at her arrival at the council meeting. It explains why some people thought this game was anticlimactic, or why the ending didn't have much weight to them. Her confrontation with Jed is the climax, not the tally of everything she did and will do with the town or by herself. The endings are there for gameplay and personalization, not narrative completion. With this newfound knowledge of herself and how feeling works, and with the newly acquired perspective the player has gotten, now is the final choice regarding the story of Alex Chen and Haven Springs. She confronts Jed, who has, until his betrayal, always been supportive. Not only that, but he's also helped countless other people in the town. Alex understands the suppressed feelings and memories Jed has to confront and how angry, sad, and scared he is about this situation. However, it is revealed that Jed is also responsible for the death of 7 of his workers, one of which was Alex's dad. The story got spun around, and instead of being labeled as an incompetent asshole, he was labeled as a hero, with Typhon covering up the true story of that fateful day, which makes the case for his good nature very hard to believe. It's pretty damn hard to think anything else of Jed other than the fact that he's a bad person. Do you forgive him or do you condemn him? In any case, the man will break down and his feelings will wash over him. However, this doesn't answer the question as to why this choice is important. It is an important choice because it determines what you took away from these 16 hours of gameplay. On one hand, if you condemn him, you are in the right. You have gone through a similar story and a similar enough situation to this man. Your memories and your feelings were deeply buried under many layers of protection for self-preservation. Even though you went through a similar experience, you didn't lie to everyone about the reason why this came to be. You simply kept it to yourself. Therefore, you didn't hurt anyone else and didn't actively make everyone else around you believe in these falsehoods. Obviously, you didn't kill anyone either, and your dad was also part of this whole equation. To me, this is enough to warrant your condemnation. On the other hand, if you forgive him, you are also in the right. Seen by the way you perceived your memories in a totally different way from what actually happened, it's not far-fetched to think that Jed was also in a similar situation. So much so, in fact, that I believe this altered memory has affected him so much that he allowed himself to feel again. While you buried your sense of feeling along with your memories, Jed didn't quite do that, and is able to feel strongly enough that Alex can pick up on it on various occasions through the story. This shows to me that he truly believes he was a hero that day up until Alex shows up with the truth. Simply because otherwise the truth would just be too much to bear. This event would always be playing in the back of his mind. If this is true, then every good action he has done is not invalidated by his previous shitty behavior. He truly is a great person that cares about the people around him and wants to help them as much as possible. In which case, he simply didn't remember what he had done and didn't necessarily mean to lie to everyone. His intention wasn't to hurt, but his actions show otherwise. Even though he meant to protect Alex and keep her away from Haldis, he still shot her. This final choice in the story is important, because it determines how you judge these characters. Is their intention good enough for you, or do you measure their value by their actions? And like every good video essay, I go back all the way to the beginning. I still think it is best if you go ahead and immerse yourself into the world the developers have created. Only you can come to this conclusion after you've chosen what happens to Alex and Haven during your game time. It's also why I want to let you decide if this game is a masterpiece or not. In my opinion, it is, not only because it's a masterclass in world and character building, but because its message left a lasting impression. It was poignant, and by extension memorable, by account of the monumentality of its last chapter and the way the final choice matters. On this note, I leave you with this. Go play this game even though you might not like narrative games. I highly recommend it, and I think it can be a great experience if you play it correctly. Life is Strange True Colors gets a score of 9 out of 10, marking the first review I make on this channel. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, consider subscribing, liking, and commenting on the video. Every little bit is greatly appreciated. Thank you for watching this video. I will see you in the next one. Peace.